So, Katie, thank you very much for talking to me and the students at the University of Waterloo. What we're going to talk about, I think, is of course very important, and your expertise in helping them understand the impact of the technologies that many of them will be working with during their lifetimes is, I think, going to be extremely valuable. So my first question is a broad one, just as an introduction to what you focus on. You look at the intersection of media, education, and politics. I'm keen to understand what that means. Could you just tell me about that?
It basically means I have like a really wide range of interests, but really it fundamentally focuses on two things, which is media and gender. And both of those things, they cut across a lot of different areas. So I've done research on things like representations of feminism in the news. I've looked at how everyday people have used social media to challenge rape culture and misogyny. And then right now I'm doing research. I've got two projects, one that's looking at what we call tech facilitated sexual violence. So the use of technologies to maybe create like AI deep fake nudes or using media to share nudes that are traded kind of non-consensually. But then I'm also doing work on things like the trad wife movement, which if you don't know what it is, your students probably do. So these TikTok influencers who are promoting traditional gender roles for women. And again, I talk about the media, there's politics involved, and then education often comes in, especially when I'm dealing with youth, because it relates to things like sex ed. It relates to how like these topics are actually addressed in their education.
So what you just seem to be describing are a number of areas where harm may be a consequence of what you're describing, or you're describing directly harms as well. And so your work is presumably looking at how those harms might be prevented or diminished, hopefully.
Absolutely.
So you are working with your DIY digital safety project, which I'm aware is particularly focused on digital harms. So you've mentioned some of these, I think. Can you tell me particularly what are the harms that we should be most concerned about?
That's such a great question. And it's hard to give a simple answer, in part because it depends on things like age and gender and sexuality. So, one of the things we say with our research is that there is no one size fits all type of harm. So, with the DIY digital safety, we went around Canada and we did 26 focus groups with almost 150 teens in Alberta, Ontario, Nova Scotia, Quebec, and the Yukon. So, it was like very diverse. And then we also carried out a Gen Pop survey with about 1,000 or just over 1,000 Canadian teens. And we were asking them, we didn't use the language necessarily of harm when we spoke to them. We said, tell us about the weird things, the strange things, like the things that maybe make you uncomfortable. Because we recognize that some of these practices are so normalized, young people don't recognize them as problematic. So, for example, if you're a teenage girl, getting sent an unsolicited dick pic is just the norm. Or if you're a teen boy, getting spammed by porn bots is very routine. And so, again, I mean, especially with boys, they're kind of conditioned to not see that as problematic. Boys are supposed to always want to be sexual. They're supposed to want to be engaging with sexual content all the time. So, for like a teen boy to complain about getting sent porn isn't kind of like, it's not normalized. But that being said, I can tell you a number of different harms that were common, but again, they differ depending on the group. So girls definitely get sent a lot of unsolicited, intimate pictures from men, but boys get sent a lot of unsolicited porn. And again, one of the things that they'll say with that is maybe boys are interested in looking at porn, but they want to be able to control when they see it. So they would tell us things like, well, I was sat next to my mom and all of a sudden like a link comes up. And they found that quite problematic. Boys in particular are getting catfished. So someone is pretending to be a teenage girl in order to get the boys to send sexual pictures of themselves so that they can then be extorted, so sextortion. So there's a dramatic rise of this among teenage boys. Um, We've seen with scandals like Grok this past year. So these nudifying or undressing apps, that's highly gendered in terms of it's mostly men and boys who are making these images, and it's mostly girls and women who are the target. To the point where actually on some of these apps, they explicitly state that they cannot nudify men because the training data is it's only used images of women. So they can't undress men even if they wanted to. So deep fake nudes, non-consensual sharing of intimate images, we could say like mean comments. Maybe the only other one that I think is really interesting that we're doing more research on is the rise of authentic violence, gore, and extremist content. So many of your students will probably have seen the murder of Charlie Kirk or Alex Preddy with ICE in the US. So and what's going on, the conflict right now with Iran and the United States. So people seeing authentic forms of violence, including child sexual abuse material, animal torture, people getting beheaded, people getting shot, people getting hit by cars. Um, this kind of content is actually being fed to teens. So sometimes we think about the violence as interpersonal, right? Like I say a mean comment to you, or I send you like an unsolicited pic. But we also need to think about how some of this harm is facilitated by the technologies themselves and the design choices. So the algorithms that are pushing this violent, extremist, gory content, the algorithms that are like pushing porn bots and like the spamming. So we need to think of violence not just as interpersonal, but also like structural and designed and deliberate.
So you're describing an environment, it sounds like to me, as someone who is not part of that environment, largely, I guess, but an environment in which young people are very subject to frequent abuse. And so, what do they do about that? I mean, in my experience, if I am a victim of a crime, I'm more likely to report that and expect that there will perhaps be a remedy of some kind.
Yeah.
What is happening around that for young people?
That's such a great question. It's such an important question. So we know probably at least a quarter of young people will do nothing. Um, and in part, it's because, well, I used to report it to the platform, but that didn't work. They did nothing. They didn't take it seriously. They didn't address it. Or some young people will say to us, like, well, the first time something bad happened, I went and told my parents, but then they like took my phone away, or they shamed me and blamed me. And so I'm never going to do that again. So we really kind of see this, like, I think really not doing anything is like one of the biggest things that they do. And one of the things we ask teens, like in our survey, is so, like, when these things happen, what do you do? And again, a comment, and did it help or did it hurt? And often they'll tell us things like, yeah, well, I went to, I mean, very few young people will ever go to their teachers, for example. Schools are like not a place that many young people feel as though there's a trusted adult. And when they do go to schools, they often blow it out of proportion in the student's view. They involve the police, they involve the parents, and those are often things that teens do not want. So we know that what teens want is they want anonymous, non-judgmental support. So things that our team often advertise are places like the Kids Help phone line, where you can call or text. It's not going to get back to your parents, and they just need someone to kind of maybe empathize, to say it's not your fault, and also to let them know what their rights are. So I think it's really interesting how you mentioned like when a crime has happened. For many of these things, like non-consensually sharing someone's intimate image is a crime in Canada. Many people don't know that. So if you're someone who's had your intimate images shared, you don't know that that is something that you actually, like, that there's legal recourse. It's a violation of Canada's criminal code, but also in certain provinces, you can also press for damages and ways of getting those images quickly taken down. So young people don't know what their rights are, and so often they don't know when they have a right to actually go and ask for help and who they should go to.
And it's good to know that at least in some of the harms that they may suffer, that there perhaps are remedies,
There
and
are.
hopefully some people who are listening to this may be able to
Well,
take advantage of that.
one things that teens are often, or not, we're all told is that, especially around intimate image sharing, there's a lot of like concern around this. And so teens are often told that once your image is out there, it's out there forever. You're never going to get to university. You're never going to get that job. That image will haunt you for the rest of your life. And one of the things our project does is we really try to challenge that idea because there are actually ways of getting intimate images taken down from the internet. So if you're under the age of 18, there's a website called Project Arachnid. It's run by the Canadian Centre for Child Protection, and there's this technology called hashing. So it basically puts a digital watermark on the image and it scans the internet to see if the image is out there on public websites. So if someone's posted that image to Pornhub, to Instagram, to like any other kind of like public chat, Project Arachnid will find it and they will issue a quick takedown order. So they will issue an order saying that that website has to remove the image. And if someone is trying to upload that image in real time, it prevents it from happening. Now, Project Arachnid is only for under 18s, but if you're over the age of 18 in the UK, they have a place called the Revenge Porn Helpline. And there's also another website called stopncii.org, non-consensual intimate sharing. And that's a website, it's the same technology, but that is for those who are over the age of 18. So most people don't know that this technology exists. And again, one of the things that really makes me sad is, especially for young people, they are sharing intimate images because that's the way that relationships are going. Digital technologies are playing a role in their intimate lives. We have dating apps. The technology is there. And so I think many people just don't know that there are ways of helping them if things do go wrong. And it's really important that they know that it's okay because we've seen some really tragic cases of young people dying by suicide, self-harming, not going to school, like really negative impacts when their intimate images are shared without their consent.
So I hope that some of the people who may be watching this will be helped, who may have suffered more before
Yeah.
by the advice that you've given. The artificial intelligence, presumably, I assume, and I may have rightly or wrongly, I assume maybe making this worse, which, I'd like to think it was making it better, but I'm kind of thinking maybe it makes it worse.
Well, it's making things worse in part because there's no guardrails, very few guardrails. So, Grok, so probably your students will be aware of Grok. It's like an AI companion that can easily be linked to platforms like X. And Grok was famous because it wasn't nudifying people, but it was undressing them. And there was a report, and there was a lot of reports about it was children who are being undressed. So you have like a 8-year-old girl who, it's her school photo, and now she's being shown wearing a string bikini. It's also really interesting because it kind of falls into this legal loophole. It's not considered child pornography because she's not fully naked. So it kind of exists in that legal loophole. But where are the guardrails on Grok to stop that from happening? And I think increasingly with Tumblr Ridge and OpenAI, we're starting to see more recognition that we shouldn't be using or just like letting AI develop without thinking through these consequences. But a lot of the platforms, will enable, and in fact, many of the platforms brag. So like the nudifying apps will brag that there are no age restrictions on their platform, basically saying you can nudify anyone. And they also often explicitly use very gendered language. So undress any girl. Now, hopefully they mean like, not hopefully, they probably mean young woman, but even just the language of girl, this very infantilizing, clearly stating there's no age restrictions, is quite worrying. And in Canada, and many other countries, actually, there have been cases where people have generated AI images of pornographic images of children, and they have been charged with child pornography. So you cannot nudify anyone under the age of 18 in Canada and most other countries around the world.
Good.
Yes, good. But I'm really sad to say in Canada right now, you can nudify adults, and that is not illegal. Now, we think that that's going to change really quickly. The government has a bill under consideration right now that I think will change that. So that is, I think that's good news.
So presumably what you've been discussing so far, uh, it may or is impacting the position of women in the world. And that leads to my next question, which is, Feminist activism, you've looked at this in the digital age as well. And given the changes we're seeing, it is uh, important. You had a book, Digital Feminist Activism. You examined there how young women used social media to challenge systemic sexism. Can you talk about how they did that and perhaps give advice to
Yeah.
women and maybe men who may want to contribute?
Yeah. I mean, this is how kind of my research in social media started. It was with the hope because it was, I started kind of doing this research around like 2008, 2009, when I started to see the ways that feminists were harnessing the power of digital technologies, Web 2.0. They were writing feminist blogs, they were forming communities, they were making connections, and it was all just so positive. And then we started to see the development of like formal campaigns, so like Twitter campaigns. We heard about the Arab Spring, the role that Twitter and social media played in like bringing down regimes in, different parts of the world, Tunisia, Egypt. And at the same time, we could see that feminists were turning to social media to um, bring attention to issues that had not been talked about. So we talk about rape culture, for example. This is a term that many young people know. Before 2011, this was not a term that was like in our vocabulary. And it was like feminists who were blogging and talking about the ways that kind of culture permits rape or makes some rape seem as like, well, it wasn't that bad because it wasn't a stranger. It was like your boyfriend or a partner. So we kind of see like the spectrum. So, anybody can go online to social media. There's different groups that you can join. At the time when I was studying it, Facebook and Twitter were the two kind of biggest platforms. But now, there's Tumblr has also been really popular. We could see TikTok being used. And in fact, in some of my more recent research, teens will tell me about how they learn about feminist issues through platforms like TikTok. So it's kind of the way that anyone can take to social media and speak. The caveat being, I guess what brought me to the violence is because many of those feminists were attacked, they were trolled, they were doxxed. And so while I really wanted to study the hope, the violence became very overwhelming. And I kind of realized that I also had to study that to get a fuller picture. And I wanted to stop that because I don't want these feminists who are campaigning for things like reproductive rights or equal pay. There still is like, inequalities in things like pay. Um, I want to support those people. And I don't want them to be trolled, attacked, mobbed when they're using these online spaces.
Okay, and so I'm aware of work that's been done around online activism, which is looking at the question of whether online activism is as effective.
Mhm.
How does it compare to non-online activism? You've looked at this, I think, too. We look
Mhm.
at it in this course, particularly around democracy, but also I think it's important in the things we're talking about. So, could you talk a little bit about what
Yeah.
you have looked at there?
So you or your students may have heard of, concepts like slacktivism or armchair activism, that because it's online, it's not as impactful. It's easy, it's banal, it's meaningless. And so I did a lot of research on movements like Me Too, which your students might know about. And I interview activists to talk about the experiences of like, what is it like to share your experience with a hashtag? What is it like to participate in these movements? And one of the things that I argue is that um, it's not easy. It's not easy to share an experience of sexual violence with the public when maybe it's something, because one of the things that really surprised me is that for many people who are using social media in this way, they had never told anyone before. And I think there's something really interesting about kind of feeling this solidarity, about feeling this community of like, okay, here's something that has been so profoundly shameful. I've been embarrassed. I haven't been able to talk about it. And finding community, finding ways of like expressing their experience, even if it's just saying things like hashtag me too. Most people are not outing. In fact, I didn't find any examples of anyone outing a perpetrator using social media because that's sometimes the critique is that they're trying to bypass the system. Most people give very few details about who it was, like what happened to them. They give generalities. I was 15. It was at a friend's house. But one of the things I found from that research was that it is hard, but it is meaningful for these people because it enabled them to find catharsis and finally like unburdening themselves of like this secret, finding community, people telling them like it wasn't their fault, that helps them on their healing journey. So there's like that aspect of it. But there's also the aspect that I always say that, we often privilege on the street physical activism. But if you don't know that there's a problem in the first place, how are you going to get people onto the streets? So I think that social media can play a really big role for this ideological or discursive activism. So I mentioned the concept of rape culture, right? If you don't think that there is a rape culture, if you don't think that there is a problem of violence against women, you're not going to get a bunch of people to march out on the streets in light of that cause. And so I think social media can play a really big role in getting people to recognize that there is a problem in the first place. And we can't underestimate that because without acknowledging that there's a problem, no other kind of social, political, legal change will emerge.
Yeah, and presumably, given the amount of time that people are spending online, that as a place to conduct activism, it would seem like a logical thing to do,
Yeah.
but because that's a good way to connect with people.
Exactly. It's the best way to connect, to get your word out, to
Hmm.
mobilize people. And that's it. So I started kind of research on digital feminist activism with the Canadian movement called Slut Walk, an anti-rape movement that started in Toronto when a police officer went to York University and told students, if you don't want to get raped, don't dress like a slut. And it sparked this kind of like outrage of, challenges that very entrenched myth that women get raped because they're dressed too slutty. And so it was feminists like really challenging that and saying, no, like that clothes don't cause rape. And really kind of like mobilizing, many of the activists, many of the organizers were not activists. This was their first time engaging in activism, and they were using Facebook to connect, to advertise, to share information about how do you get a permit. In some cases, they were like 16, 17-year-olds who had never engaged in this kind of thing before. So social media played such an important role in connecting them with each other and the wider public and spreading their message.
And I was also interested to see that your work has extended into looking at how digital activism varies between different cultures,
Mhm.
which is very interesting to me, just simply because perhaps wrongly, I would assume that online behavior to some degree has some commonality across the world. But you've looked at the differences between different cultures with activism. So what
Yeah.
did you
And
see?
places like, authoritarian regimes, we often think of using social media to amplify, to kind of like amass the biggest number of people. But in places like Singapore, in places like China, actually, you don't want to attract public attention. So social media can be useful for those back channel private forms of communication. And so in some cases, it's about being very visible, and in other times, it's about being kind of like under the radar, but still playing an important role in connecting people and sharing information.
Very important. We're going to have people watching this from different cultures and different parts of the world. So this is useful for them to know. You believe, I read in as I did research for this, you believe that we should use the term technology facilitated sexual violence rather than broader terms like cyberbullying. Do you want to tell me why?
Few different reasons. So one of the key ones is because if someone is non-consensually sharing your nudes, that's not a form of bullying. It's not a form of cyberbullying. And that's often how these kinds of practices are labeled. That is a violation of your rights. It's a form of violence. So using this kind of label, tech facilitated sexual violence, signals that this isn't just like, it's just something, it's just something that kids do. We don't have to take it too seriously. So signaling that importance. But the other reason that I like it is because nowadays with tech, so many of the harms are not only in physical spaces or online spaces, but they blur the two. So cyberbullying suggests that it's something that only happens online and doesn't have these like material impacts on you. It doesn't kind of carry in your everyday life. And often, especially if things are online, it's often more easily dismissed. So we like tech facilitated because it suggests that tech is playing a role, but it doesn't necessarily specify where the harm is. So for example, if I notify you, I don't have to I could take a picture that you posted, your staff profile picture or a picture that you posted on Instagram. Like I don't have to have any physical interaction with you. Um, so the tech may only take place kind of in this online space, or it may be cases, because what we've also seen is like rapes that get filmed and uploaded and shared. So maybe the violence happens or starts to happen in a physical space, but it carries on through tech space. Or maybe it's something that happens in a tech space, like if I deep nude you, but when you go out into the physical world, you also experience shame, embarrassment, ostracization, harm, etc. So it just recognizes that on and offline spaces are not separate, and we have to stop treating them as though they're separate and as if harm in one place is worse than harm in another place.
And presumably, the term differentiates between sexual violence and broad bullying, and there is a distinction between those that's probably important to make.
Important to make. And again, like even just like legal consequences, right? So,
Mm.
me calling you a mean name is not the same as me. It's, against Canada's criminal code if I non-consensually share an intimate image of you.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Uh, and as far as educators are concerned, you've also done work around providing them with guidance around how to deal with technology facilitated sexual violence. What do you tell them?
Okay, so lots of different things. One of the things I do is I share information on what teens are experiencing. That's the first thing. Sometimes it's explaining to them what the platforms are. Sometimes educators and parents don't know what Snapchat is. They don't know how it works. They don't know what are the features that maybe enable harm over others. So it can be things like just explaining the tech, telling them like the broad patterns of what we're finding. It's often sharing important information about laws because many educators and parents don't know what the laws are. And then it's also signposting them to some of the resources that I shared with you. So like Project Arachnid, stopnci.org, just reminding them of places like Kids Help Phone Line, um, you know, telling them where they can go, especially for particular harm. So if you're experiencing sextortion, if someone is trying to blackmail you over intimate images, maybe you want to contact CyberTip, which is Canada's website for collecting this kind of information against children. Or maybe you want to contact the RCMP. So it's just letting them know that there are places and resources. Teachers and parents don't have to have all of the answers, but letting young people know where they can go for further support is really important.
Thank you. Uh, and who should do something about this? So you've described an environment, where people come to harm in wider society. That would be something we might expect help from the police for. We might expect politicians to make laws. We might expect that companies have some responsibility for the consequences of their things they sell.
Mhm.
So, between the social media companies, government, and perhaps others, who should do what to try and improve things
Yeah.
here?
It's a great question. The short answer is everybody needs to do something. But in my opinion, the tech companies really are like they're the ones who we need to see the biggest changes from. But we know that they're not going to make changes unless they're forced to by the government. So the government needs to mandate that they report. They provide like reports about how many of their users are, underage, about the different kinds of harms that they know are happening online. I think this is maybe one of the biggest, maybe surprises for some people, is that the tech companies are 100% aware of all of the bad things that are happening on their companies. And many of them are by design. And I think that's the kind of hard thing to wrap our heads around, is that we think that these social media companies are there to like help us, to support us, to connect us, to entertain us. They are there for that, but primarily they're there to make money. That is their number one objective, and our well-being, it's not to say that like the executives don't care, but they are never, ever, ever going to prioritize that over returning a profit. They can't. They are mandated to return the biggest profit to their shareholders as possible. And even if you get one CEO that, decides not to, they will oust them and replace them with someone who will. So tech companies are not going to change unless they're forced to. And this is quite interesting because maybe some of your students will have heard that like Australia recently banned social media for under 16s. I just read a report in The Guardian today that was, we need more research to see how effective it is. But already we know that teens are either turning to platforms that weren't included in the ban because it didn't include all social media platforms, or they're just creating new accounts, or they're using like an older friend or a sibling's account that's over the age of 16. And and what we know is that tech companies aren't actually that motivated to kick those teens off. All they have to do is show, well, we did our best, we did a scan. If anyone entered their actual birth date, we kicked them off, but they're not really working that hard to kick the rest of the teenagers off. And they are not going to do it unless they're forced to do it. So I really think government has a role to play. There's a lot of advocacy for this idea of safety by design, that technology should be developed with our best interests in mind, with our privacy in mind. But they won't do that unless they're forced to do it. So I really think government has a role to play. But until that happens, we all have a role to play. We have a role to play in making sure that other people's rights are upheld. So if you see someone trading a nude of someone else without their consent, let them know that that is not okay. That violates their right to privacy and bodily autonomy and sexual integrity. Don't do it. If you know of someone who's going to create a deep fake of someone else, a deep fake nude of someone else, even if it's just for them, or even if they think it's a joke, let's just start having these conversations about maybe that's not a great idea. And maybe you didn't mean to hurt the person in the video or like the image that you're creating. Maybe you're just curious. Don't. There are lots of, if you want to see porn or naked images, there are lots of like consensual ones that are taken online. Find the ones that are consensually taken. Don't violate people's rights in this way. So we all need to be upstanders when we see rights being violated.
What, absolutely. Now, so as far as social media is concerned, am I right in interpreting your response to social media bans as not likely to be effective? It's more important that we make the platforms less dangerous places.
Yes, that's exactly right. So I've written an op-ed that's argued that, we need to be regulating the companies, not children. And by putting in the ban, what worries me is that countries will say, well, we said that, kids can't be on social media till they're 16, we're done our job. And for me, like that's not good enough, is we need to really put the pressure on the social media companies. There is no liability. They are not responsible for what we do, for how people use their platform. That is a huge oversight. We really need to change that. And we need to be shifting the emphasis. And I'm not saying that there shouldn't be, age restrictions or regulations, but that shouldn't, you know, fine, now they're not on social media till they're 17. Well, the same stuff is happening when they're 17 as when they were 15. It doesn't do anything to like stop the harm. So let's focus on like eliminating, minimizing the harm where we can.
And that makes sense to me. Uh, okay, I just have one final question. It's just a catch-all question to include anything that you feel you would want to emphasize that we've not really been able to talk about so far, or perhaps that you feel we did talk about, but you really want to make sure that people hear.
I really want people to know that they do have digital rights and it's important to uphold other people's rights. And I want young people to know that if you've been extorted, if you have had intimate images shared of you, that there are places that you can go for help. And so know that you're not alone, know that your life isn't over, you will get past this. Maybe it's going to be hard, but I think, let's have some hope and let's pressure the government to do something about social media companies because my students know that these platforms are designed to be addictive, that they're, designed in ways that are showing them content that hurts them. So let's really challenge that.
And I hope we do.
Yeah.
Uh, So thank you, Katie, for taking the time to do this. I know it is going to be really valuable to the people who will watch it at Waterloo and perhaps elsewhere. So I'm really grateful for you doing this today.
Thank you so much, Peter.